Hello everyone, how you doing? I had a customer that bought a tree online and we shipped it to him, and the tree came a little loose in the pot. It was well packaged, but it had just been repotted 4 months previously and it got a little loose, and I told him I'd make a video on how to put it in the pot tight correctly. But while I was doing that, I figured I would do a standard video on repotting. I know a lot of people do it, but it's something that we haven't done yet, and I think it's something that needs to be addressed. This right here is a buttonwood, Concarpus erectus. It's native to South Florida, to the Keys. It's tropical. They don't like it cold at all. So we repot these guys in the heat of the summer. I picked this up from someone who had gotten it from Mary Madison years ago, apparently. She had it for a few years. She's treated it with lime sulfur. It hasn't been treated in a while. And there's a lot that needs to be done with it as far as styling goes. But I really didn't want to talk about that during this the repotting video. What I think I'm going to do is just do a standard repot on it, show you how to put it in a more correct pot, talk a little bit about the structure of the tree, and wire it out and shape it after it's been repotted. I know normally I wouldn't do that. I would wire it and shape it now, but I'm thinking about wiring it and shaping it maybe next year. Just kind of get it in a more correct pot, change the attitude of the angle. There is a branch that needs to be fixed. When you look at this tree, it has wonderful deadwood. It has a live vein, powerful live vein. This is not a Tunaki, obviously. This is a correct how buttonwoods grow. They naturally develop this deadwood on the coast. It hasn't been completely cleaned up and stripped, but it really has. I see wires on it from before I got it, and there was no real correct wiring and shaping that I can see here, but we're going to start styling it for bonsai shortly after. Buttonwoods always have deadwood when they're on the coast like that. I've seen a lot of buttonwoods that don't have deadwood, and they just don't. They get this super dense, very rot resistant deadwood that'll last decades to hundreds of years. So if you have one that has deadwood, you typically would enhance that. The young buttonwoods that I see that are artificially grown, they just don't look like is characteristic of the species. So this is a nice one to work with. However, looking at this, you have this wonderful movement, and then you have this straight section here. This can be carved and worked down, but looking at it, giving it a rudimentary assessment, I think that this is just going to, it could be air layered, but I'm just going to take it off and put it in the mist and root it. So I have a little tree up there, because it's a flaw. It's not going to be a good tree the way it sits. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. Okay, so we basically sawed off that high top, and I just did some rudimentary carving. Nothing detail yet. I just don't want it to look like a flat cut. Buttonwood is extremely dense, extremely hard wood. Earlier I was going to cut it, but this is all deadwood. Well, deadwood is very hard to even bypass prune, so we sawed it, and then I just cut this down. Now this is going to be worked and detail carved and probably ran along down the vein to kind of tie into here. We don't ever want these two apices or apexes to be the same height, so this will probably be brought down, or this thinner one will be brought down. But that's not what we're doing here today. Today we're just going to pot it, change the angle. It's in the incorrect pot. This pot right here is a Chinese pot, relatively inexpensive. It has good drain holes, and it has a mark, but it's not a really high-end tokonami pot that when this tree is done would be worth having in. I am going to put it in an oval pot because this tree has soft lines, the pot has soft lines. The thickness of the trunk is ideally the same thickness as the thickness of the pot. Also, when I finish this tree, the tree will be a third again taller than the width of the pot. So this pot is the correct size for a finished design on this tree. It may slow down the development of this tree, but when you repot ficuses, they become more vigorous over the next year or two. So that'll help speed up the development, because I don't need to thicken this trunk up. The trunk's already where it needs to be. I just need to develop and wire these out and work on detail working on the pads. So putting it in a bonsai pot now is appropriate. So I'm going to take it out of the pot and show you what the roots look like, and I'll see you in just a second. Okay, so I took the tree out of the pot. I didn't do this. This is not my mix. It's a decent mix. It has calcium clay and pine bark in it. Buttonwoods do not like to dry out. They don't like to get cold, and they don't like to dry out. That's kind of their two Achilles heels. Also, they have very brittle roots. If you aren't careful when you take them out, even when you are careful, the roots, even the thinner ones, will just break off. And that's fine, because we're in the heat of the summer. I did take about 50% of the top off, so it's not going to need all of these roots to be happy and vigorous anyway. But just looking at it, without doing any real manipulation of the roots yet, this is how they typically will grow. You'll have all these feeder roots, and just with the slightest touch, some of them will break off. That's okay, because if they get too compact anyway, you'll start having issues with drainage, because not only do they like to stay very moist, but they also you don't want to get them in a stagnant environment, because then you'll get root rot. But you see these are very happy, and they grow right on the coast where it's constantly wet, so they're pretty tough. They're a pretty tough cookie. So I'm just going to open this up, and if any heavy deadwood or any heavy roots down low are going to inhibit me putting it in that pot in the right direction, I'm going to saw them off so we can fit it in there, because there is a big heavy dead chunk in here that will come through. And I'm going to give this a rudimentary brush, and after the video we'll lime sulfur it and clean it up. But the way you do that once it's already in a pot is we'll work the soil around, work it away from it, hit a brass brush to clean all this up, and then put a newspaper down below, and then brush it with lime sulfur. You don't want to get the lime sulfur in and around these fine root tips, because you can have dead roots if you do that. So let me just clean this up a little bit, and I will show you what it looks like when it's prepped to go in the pot. Hey everyone. Okay, so I took it out of the pot, as you saw. I cleaned up the roots. There's plenty of feeder roots to support the top. I found my best front. I brushed and cleaned up a lot of the debris that's below here, and then we're going to come in here and hit this with lime sulfur. When you apply lime sulfur, you wet it first, usually with a mister, and then you put the lime sulfur on at full strength or half strength if you don't want it so bright. Like this is a nice natural look. It's more subdued. And if you go half or even a quarter of a strength, you tend to get that. Down here, if it ends up being below the soil line, which this won't, but if it got to below the soil line, this will stay wet all the time. So I use either lime sulfur when it's exposed, or wait for it to dry and use Minwax wood hardener. Minwax wood hardener absorbs into dry wood very good, and it basically plasticizes the wood. This is very dense. There's not much rot here, but that's not to say it won't develop more rot later. What I typically do to prep the trees for repotting is I have two screens. These screens are actually galvanized 1/4 inch. If I didn't have galvanized 1/8 inch, you can also use some fabric. This is the needle working fabric. You can cut this to the squares, whatever you want. But I don't use window screening. Window screening is actually smaller than a 1/16 of an inch. It's like 1/24 or even 1/32 of an inch. It's too fine. What happens is it can get a lot of silt buildup, and it can start clogging. It doesn't drain very good. Also, with this, it's actually a thicker type of screen. I can take and just use a typical U and put it in there, and it's nice and tight. What I used to do, especially when I was using thinner stuff like window screening, is I'd do the double hoop technique, just like that, and it would end up being the same size as the hole, like this. So you can, these hoops actually keep it on this side, and then I just kind of put it in there like this, and then fold the bottoms out. It's not necessary with the galvanized metal. I can just use it's a lot quicker, and I just fold it out like this, and it holds the same. They both hold the same. This looks a little cleaner, but this will do it if you you know, are concerned about that. Because I did the other one the right way, though, I'm a little bit stickler. I did wet these roots. They're not sitting there for very long. They were wet just about maybe 3 or 4 minutes ago, if that. After I cleaned up the wood with a brass brush and then a fiber brush. I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't any rot or anything I had to address before I continued, and it was solid. So anyway, you put the screening in there, and you put those metal pieces just like that to hold it in. And the next thing I do is I use wire to tie the trees in. I always tie my trees in the pots. If you don't tie your trees in the pots, this one has actually nice white wire holes. If you don't tie your trees in the pots, as soon as you get a heavy breeze or a wind, or in shipping, they're a lot more apt to get a little sloppy and become loose in the pot, and they can fall right out of the pot. So I use wire, and if you notice, I use pretty thick wire. This is actually 2.5. You don't have to go quite that much. You can go 1.5 or 2, but you don't ever go 1. 1 will fatigue. Even 1.5 on the larger trees a lot of times will fatigue, and then you'll try to tighten it, and what'll happen is you'll just keep going, trying to get it nice and firm, and then all of a sudden the wire will break. Okay, if you got this tree, Ira, I'm talking to you. If you got this tree, this is how I prep all of my pots, okay? And then after I put the tree in, I wrap it and I tighten it. You can unwind this wire and you can pull it out like that, okay? Then you can take any of the mix that was there. This is bonsai soil. We had a real heavy rain. I always do this dry, but this is moist. And I put a pile of it in the middle, okay? Now, if the tree is going to be a little bit off to the right, I put the pile on the right. If the tree is going to be a little off to the left, I put it to the left. Then I take the tree. This one's going to be off to the right, so the soil is a little bit off to the right. And I set it right on top of that pile, and then I slowly work it in at the right angle, the angle that I'm going to place it. So I don't have to worry about having it incorrectly placed. Then I tie these. Now I tie these ideally to where when I put the soil in, they're going to be below the soil line so you don't even see it. That's important too, because you don't want to, even though everything's tied, you don't want to necessarily know it. You don't want to see that. So that's typically what I'll do, is I'll tie it like this first using a needle nose, pliers, and then tie it tight. Let me finish tying this up and I'll show you some more in a minute. Okay, that's good. All right. Okay, what I did is I tied it in basically to the position that I want. You don't ever want to put a tree in the center of a pot. You want it a little bit off to the left or the right. If you look at this tree, the first branch is on the left. So I want to put the trunk on the right a little bit to kind of offset that. Also, the apex for now is coming back over, so it doesn't need to go very far off to the right, because the center of the tree is going to be just a smidge off to the left. So we put it off to the right to counteract that. Again, I put it in there, I tie it tight, and then I use a chopstick. Now I tell you, Ira, or anybody else who gets a tree that's a little loose in the pot, this is the hardest part. After this, it's not that bad, it's just time consuming. I tried to dry some of this mix out. You really want to do it with dry bonsai soil, not wet bonsai soil, especially after this point. So you know, I'm just going to get some new stuff and use that. This was new until it got wet. Now I got to let it dry out. But give me 1 second. Click it. Okay, I put it at the angle I wanted in the pot. Whenever you repot these trees, you don't want to ever have them centered. We want to go asymmetrical in bonsai. You don't want to have a symmetrical tree. It looks contrived. It looks fake. Remember, everything we do in our bonsai trees is artificial. But we don't want anything to look artificial. This is natural, but it's still artificially cleaned up and presented in an artistic way. And we want it to look like it's been like that naturally. Putting it in the center of a pot tends to look a little bit more like it's contrived, it's fake. The first branch is off to the left, so the trunk is going to be just a little bit off to the left. Because the apex comes back over, and I haven't worked this yet, and I bring it up here, I haven't worked this yet or done any branch selection, but right now it's called coming back to the right, so we don't have to put it very far off to the left or to the right into the pot. Pretty close. And as this grows and develops and we get a lot more roots, I may move it even more over once we decide how we're going to repot it. I like to use dry bonsai soil. I don't like to use wet when I'm using it in with a chopstick because the wet sticks to itself, and no matter how hard you try, you can create air gaps if you're going in and amongst the roots. So I use some dry soil because it flows and it goes down into the around the roots a lot easier, so we don't have to worry about gaps. Then I take a chopstick, okay, any old chopstick will do, preferably wooden, and I work it in and around the roots. Now I don't jam it. I'm soft because those root fibers, if you remember, this variety is pretty brittle. I don't want to just kind of jam it in there and break the root tips. What I'm trying to do is feed the soil in and around the feeder roots so we don't have any big gaps. Because what happens is you get a gap in and around your roots, and the roots will actually grow in there because there's a lot of air. But as soon as we have a real hot day and those roots are growing in that air gap where some of the roots are away, it'll dry out there and the roots will die. Well, if the roots die in that little section, what will happen a lot of times is something up top will die. And you don't know what happened. This will happen 3, 6, 8 months later. And you're like, oh, I don't understand it. The tree was just, well, what happened was it wasn't repotted right from the get-go. This is probably the most important part of bonsai, is proper repotting. Artistically, you want it correctly in the pot. You can see we typically put it in the back half of the pot. We don't put it right in the center. It's more toward the back. And you don't put it directly in the center. As of right now, this tree is pretty close to the center, but it's not. It's just a little bit off to the right because, again, all of the branching is coming off to the left. But we may change that once I wire it. So I'm not really committing too far on either side right now. But again, let me pot this up, and then I'll show you a couple other things in a minute. Okay, so we've got it all chopsticked in. About 10-15 minutes total, typically on this size of pot. You want to make sure you take your time and do it correctly. If you notice, there is a ledge here, a lip. When we water, the bonsai soil won't flush out when we water. There's a nice little lip here. Also, as this tree continues to develop and grow, this is slowly going to raise because there's going to be roots in here. Don't be alarmed. That typically happens, especially after a year. You're like, oh, every time I water, I'm washing soil away. Every January, because I use organic fertilizer on all of this, every January I'll take the top inch off and maybe replace it with 3/4 of an inch of fresh mix. That keeps this down below here. I will take this out every 2 to 3 years and check the roots. Usually by every 3rd year at the latest, this size, which is 10 inches, needs to be repotted. There are some deciduous trees and some other types of trees this size of pot. Every single repotting season they need to be repotted because they're full of roots. The only time I ever repot these is when they're full of roots. I don't want them any more than like 85% pot bound, but I definitely don't repot them just every year for no reason, because remember, when you repot a tree, that whole next year it's very vigorous. If you want to develop a tree, you can repot it every year, but you're not going to get tight internodes or small leaves or really good refinement on a tree that has very vigorous fresh roots. You really are going to start your refinement process more successfully on the second or third year when the roots are tighter in the pot. We only repot for the health of the tree. We don't repot because it's a habit, okay? You should check them twice a year, but you don't necessarily have to repot them every year, okay? I'm going to water this really thoroughly. I'm going to water it in the front. I'm going to water it in the back. I'm going to water it till it comes out clear. You physically cannot overwater too much at one time. And then when it's watered, this guy's going to go into partial sun for about 2 weeks, and then we pump it or push it right out into full sun. Once this guy starts growing good, usually 3 weeks, I'm going to start pounding the fertilizer out to get him nice and established for this cooler winter when he's upset, because these guys don't like it below 60. So we'll get them very vigorous and healthy by that time. Thank you guys for watching, and talk to you soon. Okay, so just wanted to give you an update real quick. It's put in the pot. You can see it has a lot more movement, a lot more interest. This area is pretty straight, so we may shorten that up considerably. This needs to be raffiated and wired down to create a pad down a little bit lower, but that's a great trunk line. And it's going to be a really good buttonwood. But I won't worry about that next year. After it gets nice and established, we'll do some more detailed work on it. This is originally what I was thinking about having as the front. But I'm glad I chose the other one. I think that's a better front structurally. Okay?